and welcome to Lab 6 and 7. Staring in an in-person class, I usually kind of split this up because there's a lot of information on here. So, the respiratory system. The respiratory system is one of those systems that is essential for life because it brings in oxygen for all of our cells and tissues to use, and we get rid of that carbon dioxide. We get rid of some other waste products through exhaling different gases. We can exhale out. We actually lose moisture or fluids in our system with the respiratory system. You can learn about that in the lecture PowerPoint if you haven't already listened to it. So, our upper respiratory tract or upper respiratory system here. There'll be a couple things that could be review from Anatomy 1, like that frontal sinus, that sphenoidal sinus, those different sinuses that we can see. The paranasal sinuses are technically those maxillary sinuses. We do not have a model that's going to show us that maxillary sinus. We really don't see we see the sphenoidal sinus. We're not going to see the ethmoidal sinus either. We only see that frontal and that sphenoidal. The rest of them we don't see. So let's start going through the upper respiratory system. We have those external nares. Those are kind of like your nostrils. Make up those external nares. That entire nasal cavity, it's kind of this entire area. I'm going to delete that so we can look at other things. We have our hard palate that makes up both the roof of our mouth, but it also makes up the floor of that nasal cavity. The hard palate is technically made up of two bones. We have that palatine bone, which is kind of found right here. And then the other one that it's not labeled here, that's that maxillary. That makes up the front part of our hard palate. Those two bones together have that hard palate for us. Behind that hard palate, we have that soft palate. This soft palate is muscle tissue. It's got connective tissues. It's got epithelial tissues in there. It's got part of that uvula down that hangs down. That's part of that soft palate. Whenever you swallow, your tongue actually pushes that uvula up to close off that nasal cavity to prevent food or liquids getting into that nasal cavity, but also preventing you from, it also actually pushes down on this epiglottis here to cover that trachea, so fluid and liquids can actually get down that esophagus. We'll do that again when we get to the digestive system. Okay, our pharynx is the way back portion, and it's separated into three separate cavities. We have the nasopharynx for part of that nasal cavity, the oropharynx for the back part of the mouth, and then we have the laryngopharynx, which is further down where we're getting close to that larynx, that separation between the trachea and the esophagus. The larynx is where we're going to find that voice box or those vocal cords. We'll go through those here in a second as we get to more things. If you remember from the bones chapter, we have different concha in our nasal cavity. The inferior nasal concha, or inferior concha, that is its own bone, if you remember. Then we have the middle nasal concha, and then we have the superior nasal concha. Those, the middle and the superior nasal concha, are technically part of that ethmoid bone. Remember, that inferior one is its own. You don't need to know the meatus. The meatus is just the area underneath that kind of works like a wind turbine to help add moisture and so it humidifies, it warms and adds moisture to that air before we breathe it down. We have, sorry, I'm checking the sheet to make sure I'm not missing anything here. We've already mentioned our tonsils from the last chapter. The epiglottis is that piece that kind of folds. It's a piece of hyaline cartilage that folds over and covers up that trachea whenever you swallow. In that larynx, if we look at this picture, there's two different things that kind of stick out. We have one here and one right below it on this picture. The one on top is that vestibular fold. The one at the bottom is that vocal fold. These are what make up those vocal cords. The vestibular fold is also known as those false folds or false vocal cords. The bottom one is the actual true vocal cords. Those are what allows us to talk, to make noise, to sing, whatever we're trying to do. Here you see that uvula labeled. You can see the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage, the best way to think of that is in men, that Adam's apple. That's that thyroid cartilage. And then we have the cricoid cartilage. I've got some other models that show that much better. So you can kind of see what that looks like this one. Here we see that epiglottis, that cartilage that kind of goes down. You only need to know that this bone is the hyoid bone. Say, did I spell that right? Yes, I did. Okay. Hyoid bone. Here you can see that thyroid cartilage that kind of makes up that Adam's apple, that point in the front. Here you kind of get this point coming down. Below that thyroid cartilage, we have the cricoid cartilage. So these are two different cartilages that are helping to kind of protect those vocal cords. We can see the cricothyroid ligament. Again, if you remember from Anatomy 1, ligaments usually tell us what two bones they're connected to. So the cricothyroid is going from that cricoid bone up to that, or that cricoid cartilage up to that thyroid cartilage. You can also see those tracheal cartilage, those tracheal C rings. These are what help to hold that trachea open. They're a C ring because in the back, the esophagus goes behind that trachea. So when something is going down that esophagus, it allows that esophagus to expand slightly. So it kind of sometimes expands into that trachea to allow something to go down. Here we can see the backside. I like the backside better to show some of these cartilages. Here's that hyoid bone. You see how large that cricoid cartilage is in the back. You see that thyroid cartilage coming around. But what we can see here really well is we can see that arytenoid cartilage, which is this piece right here, is that arytenoid cartilage. And then at the very top, well, you don't need the corniculate. Never mind. I like to add things. Here you can see that muscular part. This is that open part of that trachea that I was mentioning, where that esophagus can kind of expand into. The vocal folds actually sit kind of in front of this arytenoid cartilage. So let's keep looking here. It's just another view. You can see that epiglottis really well, that hyoid bone, that thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, the arytenoid cartilage really well. So here's a side view kind of the trachea going down. You see those tracheal cartilage, the tracheal C-rings. You can see that cricoid cartilage, thyroid cartilage. Here you can see that vestibular fold on the top portion. So that, and then you get that vocal fold at the bottom. This is just a good view to see some of those better. So here we can see that whole thing going down. We have that hyoid bone, that thyroid cartilage, that cricoid cartilage in the front. You see that trachea with the C-rings. But here we can see the parts of the lungs. So let's look at the external part of the lungs first. Our right lung is separated into those three lobes. So we have that superior lobe, middle lobe, and that inferior lobe. Each of these lobes are kind of separated out by different fissures. So the superior and the middle lobe is separated by a horizontal fissure, while the middle and the inferior lobe is separated by an oblique fissure. Our left lung has two lobes. We have that superior lobe and that inferior lobe. This side only has two lobes because of the heart. So we have that cardiac notch, which is kind of this little imprint in here that allows that heart to have space between those lungs. We also have an oblique fissure that separates the superior and the inferior lobes of the lungs here. You can also kind of see that cricothyroid ligament. So here we can start to see inside of the lungs. So when the trachea comes down, there's this spot right here. That's not going to do what I want it to. So let's try this. Right here where that trachea is going to split. Where that trachea splits, this is known as the carina. That carina is an area where if something hits it, it's actually like, it's going to force you to start coughing, to try to cough it back up. But this is where our trachea separates into our right and our left. So that's going to be our right. This is going to be our left primary bronchus. And then from there it splits. And here, that first split, we look at that left side, one side is going into the superior lobe, one is going into the inferior lobe. On that right side, we have a split that goes three ways, one to the superior lobe, one to the middle lobe, and one to the inferior lobe. That split, it can be known as our lobar bronchus, as this is labeled as, but we can also call it our secondary bronchus. From here, we're going to get another split. New color. Then it splits off from there. That third split is going to be our, I want to go place this right there, tertiary bronchus. We're going to have both right and left side. So this is going to split off. That'll split off. This one going up will split off into 3. Those are our tertiary, also known as those segmental bronchus. So here's just some other images that we can see, like that superior lobe, middle lobe. You can see that main bronchus, that lobar or secondary bronchus. Here's another one in that chest cavity where we can see the lobes. We can see the fissures. So that superior oblique fissure, inferior lobe. You can see that cardiac notch really well in this picture. So let's come down. We're traveling all the way down now to like the minuscule, minute pictures. So now we have our bronchioles. Our bronchioles are what are going to split off into almost like little sacs. No, that one doesn't show me what I want either. So these little sacs, they're almost like those little sacks of grapes. If you've looked at the PowerPoint, the lecture PowerPoint, you can kind of see this broken down better. But each of these little, almost like little grape things, those are our alveoli. This is where gas exchange actually occurs. Let's come back up here for a minute because I want to point out the diaphragm. We can see the diaphragm here. The diaphragm is the main breathing muscle. There is no good picture of the internal and the external intercostal muscles. There's really no visceral pleural cavity, parietal pleura. There's no images that show those either. What this is showing here is kind of these terminal bronchioles that are coming down, that are going into these little alveolar sacs, which give us our little alveoli. Like here, this points out the different alveoli, these little circular kind of areas. That's what that is showing here. So here we can kind of see on a nice cadaver image. This is actually the thyroid cartilage that's pointing to where the larynx is pointing at. You can see the trachea, the lungs, the right and the left primary bronchus here. There's that trachea coming down. Then you can kind of see into the lungs. You also see that phrenic nerve. I'm not going to ask you the phrenic nerve, but that's just kind of that reminder that that phrenic nerve goes to that diaphragm and it comes out of that cervical plexus in your neck that allows you to breathe. So here's just some other images. You can see some of these labeled, that sphenoidal sinus, that frontal sinus. You have that superior, middle, and inferior concha. You have here that maxillary bone, that palatine bone, that soft palate, that uvula. Here's that pharyngeal tonsil. There's the word I was looking for. We also have, technically that's supposed to be a tonsil right there, but it's kind of in line right with that uvula. That lingual tonsil. You have that external nares. So there's a lot of good stuff here. This is kind of a creepy picture, but it gives that coronal slice of the skull. So we can actually see that frontal sinus. You see that ethmoidal sinuses. Here we can see that maxillary sinus. You also see those nasal concha coming down here. These are areas, again, where air that we're breathing in is getting warmed up and humidified, adding moisture to it before it goes down to our lungs. Here's those different divisions of the pharynx. I like this picture because it color codes them so they're easier to see like that nasopharynx. That should be an R. The oropharynx. And then that laryngopharynx. Here, this shows that terminal bronchial coming down really well. They're kind of branching out to these little sacks of grapes. And these sacks of grapes are giving us our alveoli. So here we can see, even through histology pictures, you can see those terminal bronchioles coming down. You can see all of these little alveoli here. Here we can see, again, that alveoli. We don't need to be able to identify those type 1 and type 2 pneumocyte cells. I'm not going to ask you those. I don't think there's even a histology picture for this, but this shows a really nice image of these alveoli here. Then here we can see that trachea. That trachea is lined with those pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium that's with plenty of goblet cells. Those goblet cells are secreting out mucus. That cilia is beating that mucus up towards the back of your throat. And what it's doing is trying to catch any kind of debris, any particles, any pathogens that may have made it down to the trachea, trying to bring it back up, trying to prevent us from getting sick. So you can see that C-lined cartilage is all hyaline cartilage. Here's just another image showing that same thing again. Then here's more of that alveoli. Here you can see those little bronchioles and those pulmonary arteries surrounded by those alveoli. It's in the capillaries is when the gas exchange actually occurs, though. So here we can see again those alveoli, or alveolus, singular, of all of these different areas where this gas exchange is actually occurring. And this is everything that we have for Lab 6-7. Thank you very much for listening and have a wonderful day.